Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the Grace in the Gray podcast, where we use the black and white of Scripture to speak truth into the gray areas of culture. We're back this week with the usual crew, Ben, James, and Rick.
Howdy.
Yo.
Rick, you want to get us started?
Yeah, I was going to kind of continue the discussion that we had in the last episode, and maybe we answered this, maybe we didn't. We'll just kind of stick our toe in the water, if you will, and see what happens. So we talked about the corporate world outside of the church, and then our call to pursue personal holiness or righteousness, and we bantered around a little bit about those terms and their kind of differences and similarities. But I wanted to kind of drive back in and ask you guys an opinion question and let you guys kind of run with it. What do you think it is, or what do you think is the job of the believer when it comes to the sin of the non-believing world?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think biblically our call is when we examine? It's no shock to anyone, whether you're a believer or not, that for those of us who would pose ourselves on the believing side of especially the pages of the Bible, that we would look around the world and see it as a depraved, all of those kind of things broken sort of thing. And so my question is, for the believer, especially for the believer listening, what's our response to that?
Let me tell you. I don't know. So in my head, there's like these two conflicting, I guess, like controlling examples. And one of them would be like somebody is doing a thing which is harmful to themselves, versus someone is doing a thing which is harmful to many, many people. And in the instance of somebody is doing a thing which is harmful to themselves, it seems like, I think the proper response would be to present the alternative controlling narrative of the gospel versus whatever they're currently, like, whatever story they're living out in their head, and hope that the power of the Holy Spirit and the gospel's ability to change will redirect that action. But then I think of, honestly, the story that's playing out in my head is like Bonhoeffer, Hitler, like Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And thinking like it's an option to present the gospel to Adolf Hitler if you have an audience with the Fuhrer of the 1930s and 40s. Given that he's unlikely to accept it, like, do you have a responsibility to do anything you can to try to prevent the evil that...
Yeah, and if you're not familiar with that story or familiar with that piece of history, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor during that time frame, during the World War II time frame in Germany. And you'd have to do a bunch of different study on his life. A lot of it is known, a lot of it is unknown. Some of it has become speculative and folklorish in nature. But he was credited and eventually put to death by Hitler, or Hitler's Reich, I guess would be the better way to word that, for playing a part in attempted assassinations of Adolf Hitler. And he viewed it as his responsibility as a believer to step in and to protect those that, of course, the Holocaust and just Hitler's reign in Germany had put at risk and put beyond at risk.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting conundrum, because that's one that's been debated. We had conversations about that in seminary, about Bonhoeffer and people trying to, because it's all those kind of things. It's also like, well, am I allowed to lie sometimes, or am I not supposed to? Is it always don't lie?
This escalated really quickly. Yeah. Like, now we're talking about, is it okay to kill someone to save others?
Yeah, I was going to, who you got in mind, man?
Yeah. No one in particular.
But I was going to ask, too, and this is just kind of, I'm playing devil's advocate, I'm being Ben back to Ben if I can, is because one of the qualifiers as you were trying to make a decision about what you would do is harmful. But I would ask you to give me some more defining work in what is harmful.
Yeah, in my head, I mean materially harmful.
Okay.
Not necessarily spiritually harmful.
Okay. That's fair enough.
Whether or not that's actually a good place to make some kind of demarcation, I don't have any interest in defending. It's just presented with the question, that is the structure that currently exists in my head to be torn down and reformed. Yeah, and I struggle with that because I think if you have too much fracturing in the way that you would approach a situation like that, depending on circumstances, and in this case it's just two, but who knows and how many other places it would fracture from there. Like, okay, harm to others, but how many? Harm to others, but what's the power dynamic? Harm to others, but there's a million different ways it could go. And I think the more it fractures, the less useful it is as an ethic, if that makes sense.
Sure.
But that gets really difficult because the more simplified your ethic is, the easier it is to follow, but usually the less capable it is of responding to the nuance of circumstance.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's a million different things that flow through my head, which is why my initial answer was, I'll tell you, I don't know.
Do you think that, and I would maybe characterize it this way, do you think that our romanticization of certain sin in Western culture, and so I would migrate towards the hot button things that we talk about, sexuality, identity, the things that show up, abortion, those kind of things, where we heightened just by cultural pressure or whatever may cause it, it feels as though these sins or these struggles or these battles are heightened and made more important and seem to be the thing that Christians in our culture stick their neck out to battle, and I'm doing air quotes there if you're not watching online, to battle against, seem to take more importance. Do you think that the fact that those things have been so romanticized that makes this conversation more difficult and is not necessary?
Makes the conversation more difficult for sure. Yeah.
What? Even just about to verbalize it, I was going to say, why don't we, this is not what I believe, but it was what was about to come out of my mouth. Why don't we take a baby sin and talk about that?
Yeah.
Instead of trying to tackle what you're saying is the hot button topic.
Here's the struggle with that. In terms of perfect righteousness and in terms of the way that God views sin, absolutely, they're like the thing you have always heard, I believe to be true, which is that there is no sin worse than any other, and that a single spot removes perfection. That's how it works. If you're talking about the cleanliness of sheets or the righteousness of a person, but we function in a world in which I don't know if it's a result of limited material, if it's a result of limited human perception. I don't know why it is, but I can't imagine a world in which like the system of jurisprudence we operate in would not give like special weight to certain things over against others, right?
I think some of it is like the statement that you made that we've all heard, that all sin is created equal. It also all has the same consequence from an eternal viewpoint.
Yeah.
But that does not mean that it has the same level of consequence from a temporal viewpoint.
Yeah, materially, it has different effects on the world around you, right?
Absolutely.
A fib versus murder.
Well, that's the law versus the gospel, right?
How do you mean?
Like, I'm thinking about the Levitical laws and all the things that society said you had to do versus the gospel message. So, like, today in our world, people see murder as significantly more damaging than a lie. Yeah, that's what the world tells us, but God tells us that they're equal sins.
Yeah, but again, I would draw a little bit more out of what it means for those to be equal sins. Again, like you said, like speaking in terms of eternity and speaking in how God views sin, sure. Speaking in terms of the way that they affect the world around us, they are not equal. And I think it's okay to make those distinctions. I think we have to be a civilized society.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in the repercussion for sins in the way that God set up the nation of Israel in the Levitical law, right? Anybody who commits murder will be put to death, at least in the Old Testament standard. There's another hot button topic right there as far as the death penalty goes, but versus much less intense repercussions for other actions that are done against the law. So I don't think that design for the way we function on earth is contradictory to the spiritual eternal reality that all sins are the same in that sense.
So do you think, using your ethic as the frame, just the very basic of it, not with letting it fracture out and get more complicated, do you think that it's okay for Christians to feel more passionate about certain sin issues or these hot button topics that affect the culture around us?
I absolutely do, but not necessarily for that reason.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. Somebody who's walked through a particular sin struggle, I think it is beneficial for them to be especially passionate about combating that sin and helping others to combat it. I think it's a question of strategy at that point, right? Because whether you've been through it or not, it does not give you the right to completely ignore someone's ethical or moral protestations that they don't believe what they're doing is wrong, and just continually slam them with what I would call forced accountability. But it is, at that point, it's a question of strategy, not of whether or not it's okay for somebody to be more passionate about it.
That's good.
It's not okay for someone to minimize their own sin or to favor their own sin more than someone else's, though, when it comes to identifying personal value, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I'm more than, or I have more value than you because I struggle with better sins than yours.
Yeah, that's a draw towards the world, right? Like everything that we do is moral posturing, and that's the culture around us. It's, I do this, and because I do this, I am somehow better than you. I am a better human. I am a better whatever you want to be than you are. And we see that that's the political sphere right now. It's no longer like I vote for this person or I like this. It's like I am a smarter, better, more well-rounded, more thoughtful, more educated, more complete human being. Also, you're a moron, right? And we have to sprinkle that on. And I think some of what happens, especially here in the Bible Belt, when it comes to this personal holiness, corporate holiness, externally facing calls towards holiness, is that we can fall prey to that, and that we can use our relationship with Christ to somehow posture ourselves above other people instead of recognizing that there's never been anything greater than our relationship with Christ that should remind us that we do not have the ability to posture ourselves above anyone, right? Like that's the...
Well, I think the easy way to reframe that, like when you were talking, it made me think of a study I listened to one time. Instead of, like you're talking about, your heart is breaking for what breaks God's, and that affects us all in many different ways, and it might be something that you've struggled with. So instead of posturing yourself and looking down on someone, what if we reframe it and we heal, or we help from where we have been healed? And there's a story in the New Testament, and I'll find it and link to it in the show notes, but it's someone's mother-in-law is sick, and Jesus goes to visit her, and he takes her hand and heals her. And then she immediately begins, after she is brought back from the brink of death, or even from death, she begins serving them. And so the study that I was listening to was talking about, like, she was healed physically by her hand, and then she starts using her hands to serve others. Yeah. And so that's the literal application, but whatever sin struggle you may have been facing, you then can go help others heal through that. Yeah. Instead of looking down on them, using that as your platform for helping. Your
miracle is just as much for others as it is for you. Is, I guess, a way to put that.
There's also, and this is just another level of nuance, but it's worth at least mentioning to me, because there's a danger in this, because there are certain sin struggles that, despite whatever level of conquering we feel that we've done, it can be dangerous for us to, again, use that hand in an attempt to help people. I think of people who have wrestled addiction and those kind of things in their life. And absolutely, there are some people that serve in ministries like we have here with Celebrate Recovery who use that. And there are some people who, just because of their framework and DNA, the best thing that they can do is to distance themselves from anything that may cause them to drift.
Well, yeah, and Celebrate Recovery is a good example, because there are intentionally structured
for sure,
bounds around which, like, a sponsor can interact with somebody who's they're sponsoring.
Yeah. So I would just, if you're listening to this, I would encourage you to use wisdom, especially as a believer, in what circumstances you allow yourself and what safeguards there are in that. But I think, man, the big thing for me in this whole discussion over and over again is that we drive back towards the goal of our gospel message is not the reform of behavior, right? And I think we drive there because it's easy. We drive there because it's or it may allow us to feel morally postured above people. There's probably a variety of reasons for different individuals why we drive towards behavior as the central ethic of the Christian faith, when it's so foundationally not.
Yeah.
It's an outworking of, not the input to.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I think we're all kind of operating with now 3 different imaginary stories that are informing us on how to talk about this issue. And I think the struggle between figuring out how to navigate some of these situations is going to be dependent on which of these 3 stories we feel like our circumstances are most relevant for. And the first is the one that Sam was kind of hinting at, where it's someone I know is being hurt by the thing that they're doing, and I am motivated by love to try to propose the gospel as an alternative. Mm-hmm. Then I think, Rick, you've kind of got a story in your head that I think all of us have seen before, which is the social media crusader who's trying to fix sin by picketing and protesting both personally and publicly. And then there's the third story, which I think we're still kind of struggling through, which is murderous intent for an entire nationality of people.
Yeah.
And a presumed declination of the gospel. Like I'm operating on the assumption that Hitler would not have been interested in the transformative power of the gospel. But nonetheless, there were still people being actively harmed by who he was. Like a situation like that. And I just use that one because it's the most extreme historical case I can think of. Mm-hmm. Although there's some runners up in those situations. And it feels like navigating the tension between those 3 kind of stories is probably where you want to be when you're approaching addressing sin in someone else. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I said it.
James is thinking.
What was your original question, Rick?
James, that was 20 minutes ago, if I remember the original question.
It's actually 17 minutes and 21, 22, 20.
No, I think it was just launching off of what is the Christian's obligation when it comes to the responding to the depravity of the world around us that is not the believing world, but the non-believing world. Do we have a biblical responsibility as a follower of Jesus to respond to that sin around us?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll throw a real story in with the 3 that we've kind of explored. This is a story I've not told and hesitate to tell now because I kind of make myself the hero if I'm not careful.
Let me get my popcorn.
So I went to college in Orlando, Florida, at a place called Full Sail. I was in a class of 13 people. I was the only one there from the Deep South. My roommate was from Illinois, was not in my program, but I was not around people that I was not around people like me. Mm-hmm. The way that I would say that people here on staff are like me, or maybe I'm like y'all. I don't know.
We're all like each other.
Short, yeah.
You're older. You were here first.
That's true. So yeah, I'm the trendsetter here. But yeah, one of the early things that I did was I was like, well, I probably need to round out the way I say eyes and some stuff like that tell on where I'm from. And one of the guys that was from like just south of Chicago in my class, I'd mentioned that to him, and he kind of looked at me flatly and he was like, don't change. Just like be you. So that was the early part. Later on, there was a particular guy in the class. Sounds like everybody is from Illinois. That was not the case. But the 3 people I mentioned so far, I think, are. But this guy was in our class. He was a Marine who had served like 3 tours in Iraq, and now he was doing something as a civilian. Asked me if he could ride. He had a relative in Hardyville, which is on the way back here from Orlando. He rode in the car with me, and I was like, well, this is going to be an interesting experience. It's 6 hours until the exit, and then another 2 hours, depending on who's driving. So one of the things that he did initially that I was like, I'm not sure what's going on here, because I was 20 years old. Some context, I did not drink before I was of an age to drink. I didn't have sex with anyone other than my wife, so not before I was married. Those are facts about my life. And I was driving my grandmother's car home from college, and this Marine gets into my car with a brown paper bag from the gas station. He found some cheap bottle of wine that he nursed all 6 hours back to South Carolina. And about halfway there, he said, I just want you to level with me. I said, okay. Because he had been talking about church and that sort of thing. One of the things that I did early on, like first month I was down there, I found a church and went. Period. Mm-hmm. So that's just kind of a known thing. I didn't parade that in front of anybody. I didn't make a big deal about it. It's just what I did, and I knew that. They knew that, and it's just another fact about my life. So he looked at me and said, so you're like, right now, you're a virgin? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, huh. And like at that point, whatever part of Georgia we're in, I was really tense. I was like, is he, what's about to happen to me? Is he going to tell me what I'm missing out on? Is he going to make fun of me for other things or what? And he goes,
the third option is this Marine about to proposition.
Well, he was drinking. Anyway, I'm like in this tense moment, and he goes, thank you. I'm like, what? He goes, that's awesome. He said, the fact that you are in this point of your life lets people like me, like us that are in class with you, see that it can be done. And that gives us hope. That was the last thing I expected to come out of his mouth. Mm-hmm. And that moment impressed on me that, because like some of the things that I would do, I spent lots and lots of time with these people in and out of class, at different people's apartments. I had opportunities to do things that I politely declined, that they could not have cared less, that I said, no, I don't need that. Or I'm not interested in that, or just no thank you. They're the reason that I know what a kegerator is. Guy had one, he said, hey, I know you like don't drink, aren't interested, but if you ever want to, it's here. It's, I buy this stuff so I can share with everybody that comes to my house, and you're welcome here. And I'm like, okay. I said, but you're not mad at me if I don't? He goes, no. So learning.
Nobody's ever mad that you don't drink their beer.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of my point there, is that like I had to learn through those experiences that I really don't know what, like, for me to think that me having done things in air quotes the right way, whatever it is that looks like to me or to anybody else, isn't something I necessarily have to lead with, and that I can't assume what other people, how they're going to respond to, what that looks like in my life. That moment in the car stuck with me because there were so many unlikely circumstances to lead up to that moment, to find that he's like, oh, dude, you're letting us know that it can be done. And I'm like, okay. Later on, I was told about this a year or two after I graduated. There was another guy, not from Illinois, whose mom ended up sitting next to my mom at graduation. They didn't know each other, wouldn't have known each other. Oh, your kid obviously is graduating today. Oh, my kid is too. After a few minutes, she turns to my mom and goes, oh, your son's the one that goes to church. And she goes, well, yeah, he does. She goes, I've been praying since I've found out that your son is going to church about the impact that he would have on my son. And then my eyes got big when I'm telling them, like, okay, so did I do enough during my time there? Like, what was I supposed to be doing? But the more I've kind of gone through life, I've realized that having a sensitivity to people around you doesn't require you to really do anything except, like Philip said this past week and other weeks, not during the message, during the next steps, of, invite people in and be nice to them when they get here. Mm-hmm. That's an excellent starting place.
I think the cool thing, even listening to your story, is that all of the actions committed by you that were noted by these individuals were actions committed by you for you. That's not a great way to word it, but they were personal pursuits of yours that did not involve your picketing, protesting, beating, calling everyone into submission with the belief system that you held.
It was his personal holiness pursuit that then kind of bled out. Because when you asked the question, when James asked you to ask the question again, 17 minutes later, I had the moment where, okay, so should we respond to sin? And then I'm thinking, if Jesus is our example, then yes. But then how? And then James answered the how.
I did.
Yeah, I mean, and Rick just said it too. Like, you're pursuing your personal holiness, and then people are seeing that. You're interacting them with kindness and love and authenticity. And then their mom was praying for them on top of that.
That gets kind of complex, though, right? Because there were ways that Jesus responded to sin that we couldn't do if we wanted to.
Yeah.
Like saying that people's sins were forgiven
on
his own authority is the obvious example, but also knowing the sin of a person in all its detail without being told.
Yeah.
Or like reading people's minds, like as they're sinning internally in their mind. And then Jesus, those are my favorite Jesus moments. If you ever want to know, it's where people are thinking and Jesus like answers their questions.
Yeah. Two of those examples are from the same story.
Yeah.
Interestingly.
So that's always interesting to me. Yeah. And that's always, but the comfort in that is like you see Jesus respond to both sin and sinner in his life in dramatically different ways, right? Which for me is comforting because it allows me to go, hey, inside of the gospel parameters that I seek to live my life in, there are different ways that I can respond to people who do not feel, believe, share my common set of ethics, moral values, religious values, whatever you would be, or even share what I feel is my God-given identity as a born-again believer as a result of Jesus' work on my behalf, and still allow me to interact in ways that are gracious, that are loving, but that ultimately hopefully point them towards a God who can forgive sin, a God who can deal with what the issue is. The issue is, the sin is just the outworking of the issue, and I need to point them towards a God who can work with the internals of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We answered the question we started one episode ago, I think.
Maybe.
We'll ask another question in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening to the Grace in the Gray podcast.